The air hung heavy and still over Camp Crystal Lake. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a silence born of fear and dread. The whispers started with the wind rustling through the trees. They told tales of a boy who drowned, his mother driven mad by grief. They spoke of her revenge, of the blood she spilled, and the legend she birthed. Jason Voorhees, a name whispered in fear, a name synonymous with death. Locals knew the stories. They warned their children away from the abandoned campsite, its rusted gates standing like teeth in the maw of a monster. But legends have a way of attracting those who seek to tempt fate, those who scoff at the warnings whispered on the wind. They would learn. They would all learn. The hard way. The stories were more than just campfire tales. Jason was real. He lurked in the shadows, a hulking figure, his face forever hidden behind a grotesque hockey mask. He was a force of nature, driven by an insatiable rage that only death could satiate. And tonight, he would claim a new victim. 13-year-old Dan had heard the stories too. He scoffed at the whispers, dismissing them as old wives' tales meant to scare kids. He was a child of logic, of reason. Ghosts and monsters were for fairy tales, not the real world. But deep down, a seed of doubt lingered. Dan's parents had decided to spend a weekend at a cabin near Crystal Lake. They thought it would be a nice change of pace, a chance to reconnect with nature. Dan had been excited, eager to explore the woods surrounding the lake. He yearned for adventure, craving the thrill of the unknown. Little did he know, he was about to get more than he bargained for. One evening, while his parents were busy preparing dinner, Dan slipped away. He ventured into the woods, drawn by an inexplicable pull towards the abandoned camp. The setting sun cast long, eerie shadows that danced menacingly around him. He ignored the prickle of unease on the back of his neck, pushing deeper into the woods. He would regret that decision soon enough. The air grew colder as Dan approached the abandoned campsite. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of his own breathing and the frantic beating of his heart. He reached the rusted gates, their metal cold and unforgiving beneath his touch. He pushed them open slowly, the metallic groan echoing through the stillness like a scream. He saw the cabin there. It stood in the clearing, dark and dilapidated, its windows like vacant eyes staring back at him. He took a step closer, then another. And that's when he saw him, Jason. The hulking figure emerged from the shadows, his machete glinting in the moonlight. Dan froze, his blood turning to ice in his veins. He wanted to run, to scream, but his legs wouldn't move. He was paralyzed with fear, trapped in a nightmare. Jason raised his machete, its blade reflecting the cold, indifferent light of the moon. This was it, Dan thought. This was how it ended. But Dan, despite his fear, was a survivor. Adrenaline surged through his veins, snapping him out of his paralysis. He dodged the blow just in time, the machete whistling past his ear. He scrambled back, his mind racing. He had to fight. He had to survive. He grabbed the first thing he could find, a rusty metal pipe lying discarded on the ground. He gripped it tightly, his knuckles turning white. This was his only weapon, his only hope. Jason lunged again, but Dan was ready. He swung the pipe with all his might, the metal connecting with Jason's head with a sickening thud. Jason stumbled back, momentarily stunned. Dan pressed his advantage, raining down blow after blow on the masked figure. He fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal, fueled by fear and adrenaline. Finally, with a last desperate blow, he brought the pipe down on Jason's head. The figure crumpled to the ground, lifeless. Dan stood over his vanquished foe, his chest heaving, his body trembling with exhaustion and shock. He had done it. He had killed Jason Voorhees, but the victory felt hollow. He had stared death in the face and survived, but the experience had changed him, leaving an indelible mark on his soul. Section 5. Echoes of the Past. 18 years had passed since that fateful night at Camp Crystal Lake. 18 years since Dan had faced his demons and emerged victorious. He had left Crystal Lake behind, burying the memories of that night in the deepest recesses of his mind. He had built a new life for himself, a life far removed from the horrors of his past. He was a different man now. Gone was the scared teenager, replaced by a seasoned police detective, hardened by years of dealing with the worst of humanity. He had seen his fair share of darkness, but nothing could compare to the horrors he had witnessed that night at Crystal Lake. The memory still haunted him, a chilling reminder of the fragility of life and the ever-present potential for darkness. He thought he had outrun his past. He thought he had buried it deep enough where it could no longer hurt him. But the past has a way of catching up, no matter how fast you run. The news reached him on a cold December morning, the familiar name sending a shiver down his spine. Jason Voorhees was back. Section 6: The Hunter and the Hunted. Reports of strange occurrences and gruesome murders had begun to surface around Crystal Lake. The authorities dismissed them as the work of a copycat killer, eager to capitalize on the legend of Jason Voorhees. But Dan knew better. He recognized the signs, the chillingly familiar modus operandi. This was no copycat, this was Jason. He couldn't ignore the call. He couldn't stand by and watch as history repeated itself. He owed it to the victims, to the memory of the scared boy he once was, to face his demons once more. He requested a transfer to the Crystal Lake Task Force, his superiors bewildered by his sudden interest in a seemingly open and shut case. They didn't understand. They didn't know the depths of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of that deceptively serene lake. He arrived at Crystal Lake as the sun began its final descent, casting long, ominous shadows across the familiar landscape. The air was heavy with a palpable sense of dread, as if the very woods themselves were bracing for another night of terror. He could feel Jason's presence, a palpable darkness that hung over the area. This time he was ready. This time he was the hunter, not the hunted. Section 7: The Final Standoff. The hunt for Jason was a harrowing game of cat and mouse. Days turned into nights as Dan and his team scoured the woods, following a trail of blood and terror. Each gruesome discovery, each mutilated body served only to strengthen Dan's resolve. He would not rest until Jason was stopped, until the evil that plagued Crystal Lake was vanquished once and for all. The final confrontation took place on a stormy night, the wind howling like a banshee, the rain coming down in sheets, washing the blood from the ground, temporarily cleansing the earth of its sins. Dan found Jason at the abandoned campsite, standing in the shadows of the dilapidated cabins, a specter of death and vengeance. The air crackled with tension, the silence broken only by the steady patter of rain and the heavy breathing of the two adversaries. They circled each other, predator and prey, their eyes locked in a silent battle of wills. Dan knew what he had to do. He had to end this once and for all. Section 8: Victory, for now. The fight was brutal, a desperate struggle for survival. Jason was a formidable opponent, his strength and rage amplified by years of pent-up fury. But Dan was ready for him. He fought with the experience of a seasoned detective, with the desperation of a man facing his demons. He managed to get Jason in his sights, firing round after round into the monstrous figure. Each bullet seemed to have no effect, only serving to further enrage the seemingly invincible monster. But Dan refused to give up. He continued to fire, his finger squeezing the trigger until the clip was empty. Finally, with a deafening roar, Jason collapsed, his body riddled with bullet holes. He lay motionless on the ground, his mask lying broken beside him, a symbol of his defeat. Dan stood over his vanquished foe, his chest heaving, his body trembling with exhaustion. It was over. Jason was dead. Again. Section 9: The Shadow Remains. The storm subsided as quickly as it had begun, the clouds parting to reveal a sky littered with stars. The air was still thick with the metallic scent of blood, a stark reminder of the battle that had just transpired. Dan stood there for a long moment, staring down at the lifeless form of Jason Voorhees, a strange mix of relief and unease washing over him. He had faced his demons and emerged victorious, but at what cost? As dawn broke over Crystal Lake, casting its golden rays across the water, Dan couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The victory felt hollow, the silence almost deafening. He couldn't explain it, but he knew deep down that this wasn't over. Jason Voorhees was gone for now, but the evil that he represented, the darkness that clung to Crystal Lake, that never truly died, it lurked beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to resurface, and Dan knew with chilling certainty that he would be waiting.